Okay, hello and welcome everyone. Thank you very much for joining us in our BP DEI Learning Circle, Social Justice, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in the 21st Century. I'm Kathleen Curran. I am an alumni. I'm sure of those out there. I might know some of you. Alum at Fielding from HOD. And presently an international consultant. So I will be moderating today, but I want to first kick us off by kind of just saying a word about why we're here and who's with us today. So first off, in this learning, it's really a conversation. Our goal is to bring all the various perspectives, and here we have three brilliant ones from three different contexts, three different priorities, three different experiences, to look at DEI and social justice and what it means to look forward with the lens of social justice and DEI. We know that the subject, the topic, the priority has been with us all for quite some time. But let's look forward. And we're so lucky that we have three great panelists with us today that I'd really like to introduce to you. First off, I believe many know Dr. Allison Davis White-Eyes. She is currently the Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Fielding. Her professional areas of expertise focus on strategic organizational change, strategic partnerships, community building, interdepartmental collaboration, interdisciplinary teaching and research, international partnerships, Indigenous policy, academic partnerships, and student development, both graduate and undergraduate. She earned her bachelor's at UCLA in American History and master's also from UCLA in American Indian Studies with a specific focus on history and law. It's such a wonderful, diverse background. I have to, at this point, really acknowledge that. In addition, Allison earned her PhD from OSU in higher education, adult higher education, with an emphasis on international education. And she's currently affiliate faculty with the School of Public Policy and the School of Language, Culture, and Society at Oregon State University. And her research area is so interesting too. Post-colonial cosmopolitanism, transnational feminism, subaltern research ethics and decolonizing methodologies, inclusive democracy, mobilities of culture and identity, queering of identity and space, critical nation building and sovereignty, as well as intersectionality in theory and organizational praxis. Welcome, Dr. Allison.
Thank you.
Secondly, we have Dr. Yabon Gilpin Jackson, who I think many will know as well. I understand she's quite the rock star in many communities. She is the Vice President, People, Equity, and Inclusion at Simon Fraser University. At this time, she's the first Vice President of People, Equity, and Inclusion at Simon Fraser University. She is an award-winning facilitator and organization development professional, and a proud Sierra Leonean Canadian who was born in Germany, and love that diversity as well. She is a trusted partner for leaders and professionals working to develop people and build organizational capacity for change. She has proven expertise in areas of leadership development, organization development, facilitating strategic change and systematic organizing for social change and transformation, and works, consults, teaches undergraduate and graduate, and conducts research in areas of leadership, human systems, organization change and development, transformative learning, and post-traumatic growth. So in addition, if there is an addition to being founder and principal at SLD Consulting, she served as in executive leadership roles within the British Columbia public sector, and again is the first Vice President, People, Equity, and Inclusion at Simon Fraser. So there's So much I could emphasize. She's also postdoc at ISI here at Fielding, and published a recent book, Transformation After Trauma, The Power of Resonance. Co-editor for a coming book, Palgrave Handbook of Learning for Transformation. Lead editor of We Will Lead Africa, short story collections. And I think we could spend a lot of time just exploring each of those various elements. Lastly, I'll say she was the 2021 chair and 2022 co-chair of OD Network, Organization Development Network. Welcome, Yabon. And thirdly, we have Donna Richmond, Chief of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in the Commissioner's Office of Norristown, Pennsylvania, Montgomery County, Pennsylvania. So again, a third perspective that she comes from currently serving as the inaugural Chief of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion with Montgomery County, Pennsylvania. And in this role, she provides strategic direction, thought leadership, and champions the development of an inclusive environment by integrating DEI practices into all aspects of county business. And I know that we want to know more about that. She's an experienced leader with expertise in OD and organization development, inclusive leadership, change management, leadership development, strategic planning, data analysis for assessment, and accountability and collaborative community building. So she's tasked with achieving this very important sustainable change throughout the county government and Montgomery County itself. She has a past experience of being independent consulting, management executive, working in inclusive excellence in the DEI space, vice president for student enrollment services at North Shore Community College. Again, there are so many things we could explore, but one last thing I want to highlight about Donna is that she is a soon-to-be doctor at Fielding in organization development and change with a concentration in inclusive leadership for social justice. So welcome all. I know it's interesting and important to know who we're spending our time with. And I wanted to even highlight that, take the time to highlight that background, because what we're exploring is through the lens of social justice and DEI. What does it look like? And these powerful perspectives come from academic, from university, from consulting, and now joining Yabon at the university, and government now. 3 different perspectives, 3 different priorities, but all focusing on one key inflection point in our time. So today, what we're in our conversation, we're going to look at the 3 main questions as we're thinking like a leader. Where are we going? What is the vision? What are we trying to achieve? And now, what have we learned? And thirdly, then what's next? What can we do now to co-create an equitable future? That's our big container. I want to start this conversation with a quote from Meadows. Probably all of us have read Dana Meadows' work on systems. She says the most productive place to intervene in a system is at the paradigm or the mindset in which it was created. So starting at the broadest place, the paradigm or the mindset of the organization, of the system, in your perspective, what do you consider to be the most important challenges organizations must face when it comes to this critical change and transformation? And I'm going to leave it to you to jump in to get our conversation rolling. Whoever.
Hi, everyone. I'm happy to get the ball rolling here. Thank you so much for those introductions, Kathleen, and thank you to my co-panelists. It's a pleasure to be in this conversation, pleasure to be back at Fielding. Fielding is responsible for so much of my work and who I am. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. The challenges of now in the context of systemic change and intervening at the root of where systems were formed. Uh, I think I have a response and I have a thought to share as well. I think the challenge is just how systemic going to the root and doing the work is, and how much of a holistic approach is required. I had the pleasure of being part of a group of folks towards the end of last year that wrote a book about social sciences confronting social change in these times, and actually wrote a chapter called Co-creating Our Emerging Equity-Centered Futures, and talked in there about just the holistic lens of what's needed to understand the privilege system, and therefore what needs to be redefined, co-created anew. I think, yes, we need to do work of dismantling, but this work is also co-creating and building, just like the title of this session. But also understanding the challenges that are faced by, and when I say privileged system or marginalized system, I'm just thinking in world systems analysis, not in any other frame of labeling, but understanding the unique challenges of the marginalized systems that has been created in the context, and systematically transforming those experiences and those impacts. But that requires a lot of what I call bridge work, like meeting on the bridge between the privileged and the marginalized system. It requires systemic changes in for thinking, don't particularly like the engineering metaphor, but really if we're thinking the hardware of the organization, the hard wired structures of the organization, as well as the software of the organization, the culture, the experiences, the lived experiences, not forgetting, of course, the traumatic impacts that have been created all around, because we're all struggling. The more we've created negative impacts for the marginalized system, the more the whole system is shaky, right? And the more there's been traumatic impacts all around. And fundamentally creating meaningful context to create these bridges that don't exist right now. And so what I would say going to the root is, yes, that work has to be done. The thing I am increasingly concerned about is the parallel systems that are being created because the privileged system continues to not understand fully the experiences of the marginalized system, and the marginalized systems continuing to say, you know what, then we're just going to go down this road and create joy and safety and connection and a way to live and thrive at the edges of and outside these systems. So the only other thing I would voice then is, yes, going to the roots with Dena Meadows' work, but then also attention to the Audre Lorde voice of the master's tools cannot change the master's house, right? And where's the bridge? And I'll just leave that as a question. Where's the bridge?
Where's the bridge? That is a good question. I'm going to hold on to while I hear some other perspectives to see, really, are we seeing the same because of our context, or are we seeing different because of our context? So
Sure.
Thank you very much for starting that.
I'll jump in because, I'm coming from a different perspective from county government where things have been the same for so long. And so we may not be quite as advanced in terms of our thinking about change. And I have a quote too that I'd like to share by James Baldwin. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced. And so that's where we are right now, which is having honest conversations about where we are, having honest conversations, even basic conversations, as simple as, does racism really exist? And so we're starting at a very basic level in acknowledging that in our society, in our county, in our workplace, racism does exist. And so for me, and what I've seen in institutions that may not be as advanced in their thinking about change is really being honest about what needs to change, taking a really hard look at the organization, but also understanding change and understanding change management, right? And so part of what I'm spending a lot of my time doing is educating our internal staff, as well as county leaders and members, residents of the county, about change. There's this expectation that, by hiring a chief of diversity, equity, and inclusion, that things are going to change quickly. And I hear people talking about how, I was hired for this position to check off some boxes. And so if they don't see change right away, then they're going to believe that, the county is not really serious about their efforts towards diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it really is all three of those things for us. It's looking at the diversity of our organization where there is no diversity. It's diversifying leadership. It's making sure that people feel included and that there's equity. So looking at all of our policies, processes, and procedures from a lens of equity, and really just educating people. So from my perspective and where I am right now, it just really boils down to how willing are we to be honest about the changes that need to occur. And unless we are honest, and unless we get people moving in the same direction in terms of understanding change and that, the change is not going to happen overnight, then we won't make the progress that we need to be able to make. And I'll just share one more thing. Before we began this session, I hosted a workshop with some internal staff. And one of the things that I heard that kind of shook me a little bit was that the Black African-American individuals that are employed at my workplace, they're frustrated. And they're frustrated with all the workshops, all the talking that's happening, and the fact that they are not seeing change right away. And so, I had to put on my change management hat in a sensitive way to acknowledge that, yes, I've been in situations where change hasn't happened and change is slow, but we can't do this job without all of us being included in the process. And so now is not the time for them they can be frustrated. I'm not going to take that away from them, but now is not the time to give up on working for change. And that's what I heard. They're frustrated. They don't want to come to any more workshops. They don't want to be part of any more discussion groups. So as simple as, hearing people, acknowledging their pain and frustration, and then being able to move on so that we can achieve some of the things that we hope to achieve. So that's where I am right now.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm hearing being honest, the pace, and a certain amount of fatigue, that when you acknowledge, it shows that something is happening. And don't depend just on me. It requires you. So there's our co-creation piece.
Exactly.
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Allison.
Yes, well, this is just wonderful. I'm really resonating with the comments from my colleagues, and I'm kind of going back to, how do we set that fertile ground for an analysis of structural change? How do we get people on board, so to speak, to really understand what needs to happen and what are some of those challenges? And so some thoughts that come to my mind are, it's important as we begin this journey on trying to identify how to move forward structural change by acknowledging the current culture that exists in any organization. So taking stock of cultural and organizational entropy, I think, is one of the steps that needs to happen to see, where is the culture of the organization? If we're looking to make a paradigm shift, how are we going to make that based on where people are currently in their own mindset? I think too, what often happens, and I see this as a challenge, is people lack courage, honestly, to see change as an opportunity rather than an obstacle. Oftentimes I see organizations that really get mired in problem admiration, get mired in filibustering definitions for diversity, for instance, without actually moving beyond that and getting the work done. We need to be able to move. And I see that a lot of these are strategies that are ways of deflection, ways of showing that people actually lack the courage to really engage in this work deeply. I also think resiliency is critical. We live in a VUCA world. VUCA means volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And the question becomes, does the organization have the capacity to be resilient in a VUCA world? And a VUCA world really demands that we rethink our traditional and perhaps outdated approaches to management and leadership. And that is going to require us to be more nimble, resilient, and to value the diversity of thought, ideation, and problem solving. And I think to bring it home to Donna's point, and I know Yabon also mentioned this is never the work of the senior diversity officer. This is everyone's work. And it requires deep reflection. And I'm going to also share a quote from Audre Lorde, who says, "The true focus of revolutionary change is never merely the oppressive situations which we seek to escape, but that piece of the oppressor which is planted deep within each of us." That means each of us has to do this work to make the sort of transformational change, the sort of paradigm shift that Yabon is talking about, the structural changes that Donna is talking about, to make that become an actualization.
Thank you for that. What comes to my mind as I try to weave together some thoughts that you have shared is this idea of courage in particular and resilience. So I often go to the etymology of words and the definition of words. That's my earliest studies were in linguistics, and I find I still always go to the etymology and to look at where did a word come from. And when you talk about courage and resilience being, how an organism responds to its environment. Does it change what it's eating because it's using up the resources or migrate somewhere new? So we think of what does it take to make that change? You can see something happening around you, but what's the inflection point that gives you the courage to action? I remember Margaret Wheatley once asking the question, what gives you the courage to lead? And at the root of courage is heart. So as we try to imagine where we're going, we lead from the heart instead of from the head, perhaps. I'm hearing a lot of sentiment that one can't do it alone. It must be co-created. So how do you touch the heart of those around you who you want to co-create with you?
I love that question so much. Thank you. Thank you so much. My personal values are love, courage, and wisdom. And I think we've talked about the wisdom part because for me, co-creating and seeking the wisdom of the crowd and really enrolling people into the transformational changes that we need is a part of the work. It's a part of my ethos. How do you touch the hearts of those that you want to bring along? You mentioned my book, Transformation After Trauma, The Power of Resonance. I've spent a lot of my research work at Fielding, including my dissertation and postdoc, on this idea of resonance, which I've defined as these deeply personal stories that open space for transformation. And I came upon this notion through my qualitative research and interviews with transformational leaders in their communities in these really deeply complex justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, immigration, human services, and international context, these deeply complex situations where these people and the communities they were organizing were really pointed out as transformational leaders by those communities. It was interesting to me that these were folks that were not only activists, but I think to what my colleagues have said, were people that were actually making a difference. They were moving people forward. They were moving people through the fatigue, through the trauma on all sides and making a difference. And what was common to them, and which has consistently proved to be the case since then, is they operate from resonance. They operate from their deeply personal stories that connect them to identity and purpose. The thing about that is they're not looking to the external environment. They're not looking to how crazy things are. They're not looking to how many new legislative or, cancel culture or just, general disruptive issues happen. All of that is difficult and it creates fatigue. And to Allison, to your point, people lose courage and lose heart. I can point to any number of examples from last week or the week before where I could lose courage, but I'm operating off resonance. I'm not here because I'm looking to what people think. I'm not here because, if I don't get such and such a support, I'm not going to move on. I'm here because my resonance story is anchored in my identity. It's anchored in who I am, and it's anchored in my children. It's anchored in the things I've heard from them that I want to see shift. And I'm well aware that I'm not going to make this change alone. Any one of us in the circle is not going to make this change alone. And our work, our so-called jobs, are not going to be the reason that things change. What's going to make change is a sustained action over time, because we're operating off of resonance, because we don't give up, because we understand that we stand on big shoulders, that others have made contributions that allow us to be in these inaugural and other roles. And we are here to plant our own seeds, to do what we can, operating from resonance, to make our own contribution, but to hand that quilt to the next person to sew their own corner. And hopefully in the long range, in that indigenous wisdom of 7 generations into the future, African Americans and Black peoples globally tend to say, I am my ancestors' wildest dreams, and invoke that we're here because of our ancestors. They're not wrong. I don't think 7 generations before would have imagined, as much as we find the current moment as crazy as it is, but I don't think they would have imagined some of how we're living. But they dreamt it, and they worked for it. And it's ours to do the same for 7 generations into the future. I say I'm living that. I am generation 8 now, named Gilpin Jackson, descendant of freed, enslaved African Americans that made their way back to Africa, to Freetown, Sierra Leone. And I'm married into that family. I'm indigenous Sierra Leonean, and 7 generations was starting generation 8. And we boomeranged right back to Canada, most likely where that group of African Americans that fought with the British loyalists and came to Nova Scotia, protested because they were given nothing of what they were promised, no land, no conditions for living, and made their way back to West Africa. And now I'm back here doing this work in an institution that was not designed for me. So 7 generations, long view.
Long view before, long view forward. I love resonance. And it takes, if you think of what resonates, you can't do it alone. You think of any times that resonate, it doesn't do it alone. So that's a beautiful thought to add to this. We have, in fact, I know Donna wants to add in, and you also have a specific question being asked that you might address in the same time here. Of what kind of barriers are you finding regarding change in your organization?
Sure.
So along with the courage piece, it might be wrapped up in that same question.
Sure. You're absolutely right, because I think that, we're going through a process of training our staff right now. We're going through a racial equity learning community. So we're learning about racism, and we're learning about in all of its forms. And so it's calling on us to have courageous conversations with each other in leadership, but also among the entire organization. And I think, jumping off that, having the courage to have those conversations, one of the things that I think is a barrier to change is that we might have conversations at a certain level, and we're not having those same conversations throughout the entire organization, which is a huge barrier, because right now we have mostly leaders, department heads that are going through this training. And I don't believe it's department heads that are having these courageous conversations. It's the other people at different levels within the organization that are taking the information back to their departments and having those conversations that are moving, and they're sharing information that they've learned. And so it's opening up the eyes of other people throughout the organization. So, in terms of barriers, we often think of if we don't have the support of the leadership at the top, but I actually feel like I do have the support of the leadership at the top. The commissioners and the executive level staff are all very supportive of the DEI work and making sure that people feel like they belong in our organization. I also will point out that another huge barrier is communication. So I talked about that a little bit, that the communication is not flowing throughout the organization. People aren't checking their emails. They're not reading my updates, where I include a lot of information. So it's making sure that we are communicating in ways that people will respond to in different ways. And I also think that, the buy-in, I talked about that before. People are getting frustrated. And so it's about building champions for this work, however I can. And so the people that are involved in our racial equity learning community, really turning those people into champions who can then spread the word, but also being able to, and finding a way to ease my way back into the community that does not feel that this information that they're frustrated with not seeing the change, but also buy-in from the people who, quite frankly, aren't committed to this work yet, who don't understand this work. So getting the buy-in is so, so important if we're going to see change. And, the other big area is a creation of a resistance culture. And, I fear that, we may be headed in that direction, but I'm hopeful because we have a new position. We have somebody new coming in. There's a new energy throughout the organization. We're recognizing that we can't do this alone as a county government, that we need our community partners to be able to make this change happen as well. And so I am very hopeful, and I hold on to that hope and also the commitment that, we'll be able to really see some change as long as we, try to avoid some of the pitfalls and barriers that organizations have a tendency to fall into. And those are some of the ones that I just named.
Yeah, and you're getting a lot of comments in the chat about this, because it's this idea of the honest, open, courageous conversations that it seems quite common. Many people saying, I think we've experienced that they're left at a certain level of comfort and don't go to really the courageous place. It's still a little bit more gentle, perhaps. So what you've said about a resistance culture forming, I almost see that as a tension between the honest conversations.
Yes.
One is working against the other, or they're pulling, and how to get them to pull in the same direction. I am scrolling here because there was another point about that that I've sort of lost. Yes. You mentioned, and maybe I'd really like to hear from, this is from government, which is really probably a major challenge, and from our university and from our consulting angles, including stakeholders. We keep talking about this being co-created, and it's so easy for stakeholders to drift off because, as you said, there's changes isn't happening fast enough or haven't really understood. My priorities are different. I'm a parallel culture I'm trying to hold on to, the things that you've said. So what about the participation of all stakeholders without one person, Dewey mentioned, without being paralyzed if people choose not to participate? There's a dilemma, isn't it? Does that make sense yet? So we want participation. We can't get paralyzed because we're not getting the engagement we want, but some are choosing not to. Wow, what to do? What have you experienced and what have you found that you've been able to make some progress?
Well, I'll go first since I'm already unmuted. Okay, so there's a recognition that we're not going to get support from everyone internally. So when my position was suggested, and they actually voted on it, they have to vote on it at the commissioner's level. And we have 3 county commissioners. 2 of the county commissioners were extremely supportive of my position. And if you look it up in the newspapers, you'll Google it, you'll probably see that there was one commissioner that was absolutely opposed to my position. And he's opposed to a lot of the work that has to do with DEI. So that was difficult coming in. So even at the top level, I understand that, I'm not going to get 100% buy-in. Throughout the organization, I know that there will not be buy-in from everybody. So being able to accept that and build as much as I can on the people who are champions of this work will be really important because we have a lot of momentum going right now. In terms of the external community, there's a lot of momentum there too. The community wants to see change. So my position is a little unique in that, we have our employees, we have the people that we serve through county government services, but I'm also responsible for the county in general. So, spreading diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging throughout the county. And that's big. So I know that's not my sole responsibility, or that doesn't rest on my shoulders only. But I understand that I can't do this work without our community members. And so engaging our community members is so important. So when I held listening sessions for the internal staff and the people that we serve, I also held listening sessions with our community leaders and stakeholders outside of our organization, simply because their voices had to be heard because, they represent the community that we're serving. And so to leave them out would be a huge, huge mistake. And so just like it's important to communicate with the internal staff about changes, about the vision, about even small wins, it's also important to be able to communicate that to our external community as well and keep them well informed. The last thing they want is for my position to come in and not hear anything about what's happening. And so I try to keep them as informed and engaged as I possibly can. In fact, last week we had a meet and greet so that we could come together and talk about what's happening within the county and what their hopes and dreams are, and talk about the racial equity action plan that we're working on. And they were so appreciative. And so it just takes, I can't say enough about communication when it comes to change. And when it comes to this work that we're doing, because you never know who you're going to touch by opening those lines of communication. So some of those people who are on the fringes may just, become a champion the more they know, the more they hear. You know, I'm not putting all my eggs in that basket, but I'm hopeful. Again, that word hope keeps coming up because, you know, it's so important to, you know, in an environment where you're not seeing change all the time, and change is slow to come, or if it doesn't come at all, having those people externally to also support my work is, I can't say enough about how valuable that is.
Thank you. And Allison, I know that in our conversations, I think there's something that resonates here. Please, can you pick it up from here?
I most certainly can. And I'll tie in some of the themes that both Yabon and Donna have shared. First of all, absolutely right. Communication is so central and key. And it's not just simply communicating, it's how we communicate, the modalities we use, the ways we communicate, and how we nuance our communication to meet different audiences. This is how, or at least can assist in getting the kind of buy-in that you're hoping to get. I also agree with Donna that you will always have the coalition of the willing, and you will always have the naysayers. You need to focus your energy on the coalition of the willing and ride that wave, and find different modalities and nuanced ways of communicating so that your communications, and I'm going to use Yabon's word, find resonance with the people in the middle. And that is how we begin to move things forward. So it's really having a vision. It's imparting meaning to people. People have to find meaning in this work. They have to see where their contribution matters, their voice, their experience, their perspectives, their ideas matter. And this is a way that we begin to build that sort of collective impact, right? I'm using that language from collective impact where we bring in the stakeholders, and the stakeholders are people, yes, in the formal organizational structure, but most importantly, they're the people in the informal structures of your organization. Some people call them influencers. Well, maybe they are, maybe they aren't. So positionality is something that we have to decouple in our heads. We get too caught up, I think, with power and positionality, and we don't realize that there's formal and informal power, and that rests and resides both vertically and horizontally in any organization. So you have to be a person who is open to doing that sort of open, inclusive way of bringing in the collective. And I loved what Donna shared about, of course, in the work that she does, it's both within the organization and in the community. And each of us is going to probably define community in many different ways at Fielding, because we're a distributed learning community. That sense of community is a little nuanced and different than perhaps what Yabon is working with and Simon Fraser, or Donna, working with government. Nevertheless, the idea of community is critical and important in being able to identify what is the community that makes up who we are. And I'll stop there.
I'd like to add a tiny bit just to reinforce so much of what has been said. And I'm really privileged to be at Simon Fraser University because we are Canada's engaged university. We have insisted on engaging community. And I also come out of government, healthcare, Canadian public healthcare, where I spent 10 years in a distributed system serving the largest region in BC in terms of by size, by just the growing population, because we also had the regions that have the most immigration coming into Vancouver. So I bring all of that lens as well as the consulting lens to this response. And it's really just building on what you both have said. This is where, for me, this is about taking a transformative learning and transformational change lens, not just any change. This is transformational work within a complex adaptive system and systems. And so leaning into those dialogic organization development and complexity science methodologies, which Allison already said, go with the coalition of the willing. People often worry about leaving people behind. And I'm going to challenge, because I know some folks in our OD space have been challenging our language around buying. We're assuming then we have something we're selling that we want people to buy, when what we need to do is really just amplify what's already working, build on where there's energy. I think from a transformational change lens, we need to remember that what we're doing, and a transformational learning perspective, is creating the conditions for transformation, and we can't control what people are going to do. We are applied social scientists. We know how people work. We know how groups work. We know how systems work. And I think for me, I find energy in leaning into what are the conditions we need to create in this circumstance that really moves people organically to self-organize, to create what it is that we're hoping will happen. We don't have control, but we can create those conditions. From a systems lens, I'll also point to going up a level or down a level. In my consulting life, I'm often coming because people are feeling stuck. Donna, and some of the conditions you've described, the people of color being fatigued and not wanting to speak anymore, a resistance culture being created. And I think we need to remember when that's happening, it's again, holistically looking at the strategy we've created, go up a level, go down a level. Let's not keep asking people to come to the table and share their stories. That's being called trauma porn now, right? Like, what's the point at which we have enough awareness, bring the willing along, and look at other interventions, have a holistic strategy? Yes, there needs to be consciousness raising and learning and facing the truth. Alongside that, some systemic things, small wins, someone said, some systemic things can happen. Some strategic teams can take on a big piece. You can move the system, look holistically at your strategy, and go up a level and down a level. I found inevitably when I go meet with people from a consulting place, when we're close to the change, the sun's in our face, we're not seeing what's around the corner. It really has been, okay, but what else is possible right now? And moving in the levels of systems to different areas, knowing that all of that will contribute to the systemic change eventually and to the transformation, because that's how complex adaptive systems work.
Yeah. I love the contribution. I think we do have a tendency to look at what's not working and try to address the problem. How many times do I, even in my consulting work, talk about it? It's not about the problem. We're looking at the outcome. We're not in problem-solving mode. And yet what you're saying is absolutely right. Creating the conditions for the type of flourishing you have in your vision. A couple of the comments really support this. Someone has questioned, again, I'm going to paraphrase rather than finding the actual one, but she questioned about the idea of the heart and how much we need to, here we go, I find it from Denise. Courage can be sourced from love, and love is infinitely abundant. Maybe we just need to question our beliefs around the quantity of love we believe we have available and why. So it's an interesting thought, because one of the other questions or statements is from Sabrina about it being very important for the leadership when you are creating the conditions. I added that paraphrase in there, but she said, important for leadership to be transparent, empathic, and vulnerable about when they try a new approach and get it wrong. So without going into trait theories, what would you say are those leadership characteristics that you've now been called on to call forth in your new roles in leading this transformation? Not just a change. Totally agree, Yabon. Not just a change. It is a transformation. What are the conditions that you feel called forth? You can start with anyone. Allison, I think you've been at fielding a little bit longer than it sounds like Yabon and Donna have been in their roles. I'm not really sure. but I'm just gonna kick it off with you and ask you about creating the conditions. What are the leadership capacities that you find the most significant, especially I can add to it, that really inspire you, therefore inspire others?
Well, thank you for that question, because I think it's an important question for every leader to ask themselves when they step into any leadership role. And so I'll try to be brief to allow my colleagues opportunities to share as well. I think for me, coming to fielding, and I shared this actually in my interview, is that I really see the work that we do in diversity, equity, and inclusion as really spiritual work. It's rooted in a true love and faith in humanity. And that is my anchor. And as long as I stay anchored in my values, and I think I heard Yabon speak to this as well, then I know that I am charting the right course. And I know that what is within me will resonate, and those who have that same resonance will come and join me, because they too have faith in humanity and in life. So I think leading in this way is, I use the framework that a good colleague of mine, Dr. Yvette Alex Asenso, developed, called the LACE framework, LACE. And it stands for love, authenticity, courage, and empathy. And I think holding close to the LACE framework in doing DEI work really helps to center it and anchor it again in some rooted values. I think the other thing in leading this work is, and I really try to impart this to others, and I think you heard a lot of this in what Donna was sharing about her organization and people's impatience and fatigue, right? DEI fatigue, and that's not just in Donna's organization. This is a national phenomenon. This is happening everywhere. But I really try to impart to people that they need to recognize we are on a journey. We are on a journey together. It is not necessarily a destination. It's a journey. And the journey is going to change, and the context is going to change as we go on this journey. And the question is, are we willing to keep moving forward together? And this requires us to really enter into what Martin Buber called an I and thou relationship with one another. And if you're in an I and thou relationship, then you're able to do the thing that Sabrina Epps so cogently posted here. You're able to be transparent. You're able to admit when something doesn't go well. You're not only able to admit when something doesn't go well, but you're able to sit in conversation and figure out what could we have done better or different that would make a difference. And so it really requires that level of building trust and vulnerability. I noticed that word was used in the chat. When we get to that place, then we're able to build a sense of the beloved community. But we can't do that if we are not transparent, if we're not going to recognize that we're on this journey together. And most importantly, and I think as a leader, this is really sort of the art of leadership, is leading beyond, well, right now in our country, maybe even the world, we live in a very polarized world. It's very hard for people to talk across lines of difference. People are definitely in whatever mind camp they're in, that's where they are. But I think the art of leadership is moving beyond the tyranny of the or to find the genius of the and. And that is what this work will require of leaders. And that those are the things that I'm holding as I move forward here at Fielding.
Beautiful. Genius of and.
Oh, I love that. So I'm just going to jump right in on that one because that aligns. I think you've heard me already say, operating from my values, love, courage, wisdom, that's sort of my daily compass. And I have the behaviors attached to that are very much about what I call the 3 Ps of presence. Showing up. This work is so complicated. There are days where I'm tired of reading the briefing notes. I don't want to read one more briefing. I just want to show up and be present to what's there for people. So all of you who use theory, you work that like let go to let come. And there are many days I just throw away the papers and just show up in my presence, right? So presence, that perseverance in terms of not giving up, that's my courage, not giving up just because I've just had another hard conversation or whatever the case may be. And then use of power. And I use that intentionally. And some have talked already about there's the positional power that comes with having these roles, you know, and then there's all the complications of wearing the social marginality of who I am just by showing up as a Black woman, and how that might want to moderate that power. But I do not give up my personal power that comes from my resonance. I show up in rooms and I show up fully with my presence because I know I have power in who I am, in my identity as someone that is in this world to do the best I can in this moment in history. And just like Alison, what you said, it's you know, all the analysis around, you know, these greats we look at, whether it's Nelson Mandela or any of the others that we've evoked here, they came from that place of spiritual personal power that they did not let go in doing this work. And so I stand in that sort of power, perseverance, and presence. But I do want to say in that sort of the power of, and we are in a space in time, where is the bridge? We need to engage those polarities. We need to engage those dialectics. And we know not everybody is going to come along. So it's not about forcing anyone to change perspective. Again, it's about creating the conditions where people can at least hear, even if they're not going to shift off where they are. I tend, therefore, to love, there's many frameworks on transformational leadership, but I love Robert Quinn's fundamental state of leadership, because it engages polarities and because it engages the difficulties that we need to do in work like this. So things like detached interdependence, showing up in that empathy, hearing all the views, but being detached enough, like, so that we're not fusing so much with things that align with our position, that we close down the conversation for other people, right? Those things around grounded confidence, like, you know, like, or adaptive confidence, being confident in where you think we need to go, but being willing to adapt, right? So the fundamental state of leadership includes these transformational leadership behaviors that are polarities, and says that as transformational leaders, you have to engage both tough love, right? So another reason I like that one, tough love. We have to love radically everybody involved in these conversations, but we have to be tough on the boundaries. I tell people, I don't get to make these decisions. There's a board and there's a government that is involved in some decision making for this public university. And I'm here to represent people and equity at those decision making tables. And to love radically the people I've heard from, to represent their perspective. But I have to be tough to come back with the boundaries I'm given, right? To say, you know what? Right now, the system is not willing to go past this place because of financial reasons or whatever. And people don't like hearing that. And it's hard to deliver those messages. But I have to be tough and loving enough to do both, to be honest with people. And the last thing I'll say is, I think we make a mistake a lot in terms of engagement. We engage people openly and we don't share those tough love messages. We don't share those boundaries, and we do ourselves and them a disservice. We raise expectations around what's possible when there is a boundary that we know cannot be crossed. And B, we then contribute to that apathy and that resistance culture that's building, because we're not honest about how hard or how long or whatever the boundary is we've been given. So I just think we need to engage those polarities and show up and see what happens. So sorry, longer than I intended to. So I'll just pause. Turn it over to you.
It was very beautiful. And it speaks actually to several comments in various ways in the chat. That there's, I think it goes back to that comment about love being so powerful. I'm a huge fan of a model that says we fuel our actions through intent, love, hope, and care. And that's what you're speaking about, is the fuel that drives it. It's not just the actions that we take, and we can create conditions and all these things, but what's driving it. So your 3 Ps are really beautiful. And it looks like, where's the bridge? Where's creating the conditions for the best, most effective, beautiful bridge to be built? Of what materials? Seems we want answered, and we'll always be seeking the answer. One person, Mikilan, I'm not sure if I pronounce your name properly, but I can hear the frustration in the comment about the resistance in systems not even acknowledging the need for better diversity practices. And the question is then, that you kind of touched on, and maybe we just want to really emphasize further, how do I hold to what is meaningful without being drained by dissonance? I mean, does this summarize what you, or does your response really summarize that question? What is interesting actually is in 3 different places. I'm interested in this evolution that you have all gone through, a never-ending evolution of growth as a leader. What were maybe some inflection points in particular in your context? Because we have people listening in various contexts that brought you to what you believe and embody at present. Any particular inflection points, triggers, ahas, realizations? What brought you to this place?
I'll go, because I've given this a lot of thought. Before I took this position, I was absolutely in love with higher ed, and I still am. I have a soft spot in my heart for community colleges, especially. But all throughout my career, I've been, my focus has been enrollment management. And so I have had the pleasure of interspersing diversity, equity, and inclusion throughout my work. But I think before I took this position, my former president, my former supervisor at North Shore Community College in Massachusetts said to me, because he's always been a big supporter, he said, "You will do great in this position if you just be yourself." And he said, "You are enough." And it took me days to understand why he said that. And what I have found in my leadership is I need to be authentic as I can be in this role. I heard the other panelists talk about love, faith, vulnerability. And I think that, I've been authentic in my other positions, but not as much as I am in this position, simply because I believe somebody said to me, you need to be authentic in your leadership. And, I was focused before on being a transformational leader and all that took, and being a servant leader, and all, checking off the boxes in terms of, how am I the best servant leader that I possibly can be? But I think what's made the difference in my leadership this time is that I'm just being me. I'm not trying to be a vice president that's trying to become a president. I work for county government, so there's tons of politics. There's tons of politics in higher ed too, but the politics, I'm not concerned about the politics that's going on. I am genuinely concerned about making a difference in the lives of the people that I have been entrusted to serve. And that drives me every single day. And so all the leadership skills that I've been able to build upon over the past 20 plus years in higher ed, and in consulting, engaging with people and so forth. All of those things have kind of culminated for me in this position. So this position for me is what's the term they use? A mission of love. I can't remember the exact term that people use, but
Labor of love.
Labor of love. Thank you. It really is. I'm thinking about the legacy that I'm going to leave behind. And so for me, this position allows me to take my passion, take my skills, and quite frankly, even, and I don't get to use this enough, but take my love for humanity, and have that propel the work that I'm doing. Clearly, I have to have certain skills, right? Otherwise, I probably won't be successful. There's certain things that I know I'll have to implement, but being in a position to be able to come to the table as your full authentic self, I don't think I've ever experienced that kind of freedom before in my career. And it feels good. And don't get me wrong, I face all kinds of challenges every single day, but those challenges don't seem insurmountable. And I'm not the type of person that walks around with rose-colored glasses on. That's not me. I'm very realistic. But, one of the things that I'm hoping to be able to create for other people in our workplace and in our community is this sense of belonging and this sense of being able to come to the table as your full authentic selves. I mean, imagine, sometimes I just sit and I imagine how powerful it would be if everybody in our organization could feel what I'm feeling right now in terms of having the freedom to bring your authentic selves to the workplace. I started this job in October, and not to pat myself on the back, but I've accomplished some pretty significant things in that short amount of time. But that's only because, I'm being me, I'm being real. And although, I have some apprehensions, the fear that I might have felt in other positions about speaking up, speaking out, I don't have that same kind of fear anymore because I'm relying on who I am and what I have to bring to the table. Now, that may not have 100% answered your question, but it felt good getting that out. Let me just
I like the fact that you feel you belong in our circle so much you can be authentic and say what you want to say.
Absolutely.
I completely resonate with your expressions, and so do people in the chat. So thank you.
And that's what I want for people in our organization, ultimately. I don't want them to have to hide behind or hide from the fact that, they're coming from a certain culture, they're LGBTQ+, or they're a person with a disability. I just love the fact that if we can get people to a place where they can feel comfortable bringing their authentic selves to the organization, how much can get done in that organization. That's one of the things that drives me.
I just add to the conversation here from Dewi in the, and maybe I pronounce it Debbie, I'm not sure. She raises the aspect of boundaries because, the tension between freedom and boundaries, freedom and structure. Structure gives freedom, can give freedom. She asked about boundaries and expectations before designing for action. Now and then also question boundaries if many participants question them. So I guess what she's asking is, we want freedom, the freedom to be ourselves, but how can boundaries help that so that it is harnessed, I guess we could say.
Let me just say that boundaries are important. They're very important. And I can't imagine a workplace without some boundaries. And the freedom that I feel is not a freedom without boundaries. There's certainly boundaries that exist. But I think that, having the freedom and I can think of a handful of people that if you gave them the freedom to be their authentic selves, you might have a problem. You might be worried about that. But those are few and far between, and I have just been a witness to people who have been allowed to not have to carry the burden. Really what I'm talking about is the emotional tax that comes along with being a person of color in the workplace, and being able to shed that emotional tax and feeling a sense of freedom, that, what you have to bring, who you are, is enough. And sometimes, as a person of color, we don't always feel that, we feel like we have to work overtime, twice as hard as everybody else. And so that kind of a freedom I'm talking about. And also just a freedom, again, to just be Donna. I don't, like I said before, I don't wear my heart on my sleeves at all, but I have learned that it's okay for me to love Montgomery County. It's okay for me to love the stakeholders that I work with. Being able to bring that part of myself into my work is very freeing. And it makes a difference. I don't know about anybody else, but it has made a difference for me in how I approach this job.
Thank you. And has it made a difference to you, Yabon or Allison?
I mean, absolutely. I could talk for days about love as a theory of change. And again, if we look at, actually, I do write a little bit about it in Transformation After Trauma, because if we look at some of our social movement icons, what anchored them is exactly the things we're talking about, that personal resonance, that deep love for humanity that everyone has mentioned. You cannot do this work on your own steam. Like, it has to be something beyond at that deep level of meaning making. And I think even the earlier question about how do you balance the dissonance of seeing change at different levels, again, for me, it's operating from that place of resonance. It's knowing that I might have a block at one level of the system, but what I'm doing at this other level of the system is not wasted. 7 generations out. It may be people in that classroom, I think, to the example that was given, that will go into the future and make one of the changes that I'm not able to make today. And so that seed planting, I'm setting the conditions, I'm doing my bit, I'm contributing to what can change where I am now. And I'm just operating from that radical love. What continues to be inflection points for me, again, I'm operating from resonance, from those deeply personal stories within my family. When I get tired and fatigued, I remember the day my daughter came home and said, someone said to her, nobody wants to play with you because nobody wants to play with a little Black girl. Or I remember the day my son came home from a well-meaning international service presentation and looked at me and said, very casually, Mom, I don't want to be African or Black anymore. And in unpacking that, it turns out that, he's like, I see no dignity when Black and African kids are shown. I only see poverty and hardship. So I don't want to be that. It's those moments for me. It's those moments for me. And as I say of resonant stories, they're not only our happy stories, they're the stories of deep pain. And for me, I come from that place in, I might have the hardest time with whatever group I just met with. And I remember that what they're sitting with could equally be pain. And what I'm sitting with is I want a world that's different for my children, right? And that comes from me. That doesn't come from anyone else. And so help me God, I keep marching on.
Yabon, I really cannot follow what you just said. Absolutely. And as I was thinking, doing my own reflection about inflection points in my life, there are many. Also many experiences where my son was called the N-word. And I was like, wow, I thought that perhaps we had arrived at some point where we had moved beyond that as humanity, but no, there are always these challenges. And so these inflection points come up and they're a reminder of just how important this work is. I think there's also, with some of these negative experiences, there's those moments of real connectivity with other communities. And much like Donna, some of my early work was working as in enrollment management as well. And some of the most rich human experiences and learning experiences for me was going into farm worker communities and talking to farm workers, the parents, the aunties, the uncles, about their young people, getting them into college and helping them understand how to handle that financially and what that means, and reassuring people that their young individual, their student, was going to be safe in an environment that was culturally very different, academic culture very different for many people. The same in working, I used to work in a program that in Los Angeles worked in the Black neighborhoods there, and we would hold workshops for families, again, not just for the students, but for the whole family unit. And we'd have them in places like Red's Soul Food Kitchen, you know, working with the community and trying to lift up the community. And it was these moments, these inflection points that give me hope, give me energy, traveling to tribal communities where very few people would go out and actually do enrollment management. And more recently, and I say this because I think it's important to say this, rural white communities where there is white poverty, which is hidden in America. We don't talk about it. And that is a conversation that must be had if we are going to build bridges. And so I think that these are the sorts of inflection points that, at least in my mind, keep me going. And I also want to respond to the question that was raised by, I think it's Mikalan, about what do you do when you work in an organization that doesn't support you? How do you keep yourself from becoming drained, right, by the dissonance? You know, that is very difficult and very challenging. One of the strategies, because I've had this lived experience at a previous institution, is to create community with like-minded individuals from other institutions, create consortiums, create a body of people and share information and knowledge and possibly resources, even come together on a grant that you do for a specific program. I found that gave me life, it gave me energy, and it gave me hope. And I realized I wasn't isolated and alone. So reaching out, that's why events like this one are so important, because this will be an opportunity for you to reach out and touch people like Yabon, like Donna or others here, and begin to build your network that will support your work wherever you are.
That's a wonderful way of starting to tie us up, because we have about 12 minutes left. And what you've just described is such a nice way of bringing us to reality and actions. Because when we talk about love and this inspiration, and if I draw together some threads, the genius of "and" has stood out, building the bridge, and honest communication is one of the pillars, one of the foundation. Love, hope, courage, resonance, part of the foundation. But when we leave it at that, a lot of times we lose people, don't we? Because it seems a bit intangible and sounds very nice. But what do we really do as we try to get to some actions? There's a future of work coming, right? Look at the changes that are going on in terms of the Great Resignation or a new way of working. People saying, I don't want to work like this anymore. And they're the ones now taking the power to say, I'm not going to fit into this hierarchy, that paradigm that has been constructed or created years ago. I want something different. And that's an interesting piece for our conversation with where we're going with social justice. So if we can, the reaching out, the touching, the concrete events, net weaving, I like to call it now, not just networking. What can you see going forward? And this will be a last comment for each, if you will, of a few minutes of what's going forward do you need to foster these opportunities for equitable futures in your communities. It's part of co-creating, right? You can't do it alone. So concrete, what do you see as accommodating in your various sectors this future of work, people wanting something more and different? Big last question, you have 2 minutes to answer.
Well, maybe I'll jump in and break the ice, and
Okay.
then others can weigh in. You know, this is a really interesting question, and I think COVID-19 has been the catalyst for us. And I hope we learned some lessons. I'm beginning to wonder if we have, but I want to be cautiously optimistic that we have learned some lessons about equity, because if there was one big lesson out of this whole COVID-19 experience, it should have laid bare to everybody the glaring inequities that exist in all of our systems, and that we do need, as was said by Donna and Yabon, serious systems change, which again requires all the things that you've heard us talk about earlier. You know, I just would say that, you know, thinking about what we need as far as change in the workplace to move forward, I would say the biggest thing that pops in my head right now is meaning. People need to feel that the work that they're doing is meaningful and that they matter. And I really think that is at the core what DEI work is. It's about meaning making and making sure people matter. We're not just counting heads, we're making sure that heads count. And I really feel that the workplace moving forward has to be inclusive by design for everyone, and COVID gave us an opportunity to really do that. It's something that people with disabilities have been asking for decades, and we're now beginning to have that conversation in earnest. But it also means changing the way that we construct meaning in work. And I think that's going to be a very interesting, I'm hoping it will be a shift, I really do, but I think it will be a very profound paradigm shift for how we understand what work means to people and how we create meaning.
I'll jump in and thank you. That's brilliant, Allison. And I'll just start by saying there's no easy answer to the future of work. There's no quick solution. I think, you know, we have the tools to bring that systematic I think organization development and design, this is where those skills come in, systematically going out to all the communities represented in your workplace. Yes, the equity deserving groups that we're aware of, but also contextual equity. Allison, love that you pointed to remote and rural communities where there's white poverty, depending on your context. You know, I've worked both when I was in healthcare, and I came out of leading and starting an equity office in a Crown corporation within BC before I came to SFU. We have a lot of remote workers, isolated workers in that community. Northern BC, where they're the only one working for this government agency. You know, town halls are never designed at times that work for them, and that kind of thing. And my team beat the drum on no, we need to think contextually about our remote and isolated workers and think about them as we're designing the future of the hybrid environment and etc. So thinking about your communities, talking to them, listening to what they needed. Was for the remote folks, it was really simple. Shift change. Can you schedule these damn town halls and shift change? so that we can actually call in and not have to listen to the recording. It was something like between 1 and 3. It was simple. It's not like corporate, those of us sitting in corporate offices couldn't do that, right? Never ask the question. So go out, ask the questions, design based on that. But I think I want to leave with this. Absolutely have to show some action. That team I just described had to really champion some unexpected, some things were little tweaks like timing of the town halls, and other things were taking to the board some unexpected but relatively easy things to do to create a workplace where when we're asking people to come back from COVID, that people could actually come. Some things we did differently for parents. And, some things we did differently with how we defined core hours of work, right? So even if you were coming to the office, the expectation was you were there at core hours, but parents could leave and go pick their kids and go work from home the rest of the day. But if they were in the office during core hours, that was considered a day in the office, right? For those that wanted to be in the office 50% time. So just being creative, but actually putting in place some of these creative options early enough so that people can see the future of work is now. It's already here and they can come to work because the conditions work for them.
Nice, nice. You've shifted us from focusing on diversity and inclusion to social justice as a broader umbrella. Actually, this is what I hear in it, but the contextual equity and asking, brilliant. Donna, I leave the last one, the input to the picture from you.
Yeah, I'm going to lead with accountability. I think employees are expecting more accountability from their leaders, and rightly so now. I think, the pandemic and social justice issues that have arisen are really calling for our leaders to be accountable. And so I strongly believe that employees, people within an organization, our stakeholders need to hold us accountable. They need to ask the tough questions. And we need to recognize that we need to be accountable to them as leaders. I will also say that, putting on my enrollment management hat is that data is important. So if you don't have people that believe in DEI, show them the data about your organization, and realize that data tells stories too. I strongly believe in storytelling and narratives about what's happening about the people within our organizations. But I think that, we can't forget how much our data tells stories as well. So accountability, assessment, using the data, qualitative and quantitative, I think all those things go hand in hand, but hold us accountable.
Oh, you've asked us to do that. Okay, so everyone who is listening knows that we can't do this alone. We must co-create the future we want, and therefore we're all responsible and all accountable, and we have the responsibility to hold you accountable, leaders out there. So we've come to the last few minutes, and I would like to